welcome. My name is Sarah Drinkwater, and as Maggie mentioned, I direct a team focused on beneficial technology at Omidyar Network, a philanthropic venture investor based in Silicon Valley. And today we are talking about how we innovate with data to meet the demands of an ever-changing world. And I'm lucky to be joined by three incredible panelists who I'll be handing over to introduce themselves. First up, let me welcome Zoe Peden from Ananda Ventures.
Hi, I'm Zoe. As Sarah says, I'm from Ananda Impact Ventures, and we're a late seed Series A impact investment fund that look after the whole of Europe, but I look after the UK. Oh, and
Thank
my
you.
background is I was an entrepreneur in assistive technology for 10 years before I switched to the other side.
Thank you. And then next up, we have Amit from Experience House.
Yep. Hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Amit Patel. I'm the creative director of Experience House. We are a design and innovation training company based in London. We provide training across design, innovation, technology, marketing, and growth, various areas, especially focusing on experience design for both the B2C markets and B2B. So a lot of our corporate clients are very interested in digital transformation and innovation. For example, we have a number of students who come to us to upskill, learn new things to kind of future-proof their careers as well. I've spent the last 5 or 6 years dabbling in and out of various startups across fintech, media, education, and prior to that, I've spent a number of years working in public infrastructure projects like Crossrail and Crossrail 2.
Thank you and welcome. And last but not least, we're joined by Stephen from Innovate UK.
Hi everyone, so I'm Stephen Browning. I am currently Interim Director of AI and Data Economy at Innovate UK. I also am the Challenge Director for one of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund programs called Next Generation Services. For those that don't know, Innovate UK is the UK's innovation agency, part of UK Research and Innovation, which is government funded, but arm's length from government. And our role is to support business-led innovation to drive economic growth and support societal impact.
Fantastic, thank you. So having been tuned into the conference for the last couple of hours, I've been having a wonderful time with DocSpot, learning about education, skills, all these wonderful topics. And it struck me that data and innovation are both quite slippery words. You know, data particularly can seem quite remote, when often what we're talking about is information that we've made, that we've shared, that is held about us, that is communal information, whether about our family, our community, our societies. And it's a little bit like a currency. You know, it's not very evenly distributed. Some of us have a little bit of it, many of us have lots of it. And, you know, our currencies are not valued in the same way. For example, what I'm worth to a business might be very different from what you're worth, in a way that often can reinforce a lot of structural inequalities. So in this conversation, we're really talking about that social layer, particularly this year when all data became health data, you know, where we live, where we go, who we're with. You know, we are living through a year of kind of multiple crises. I'm sure nobody needs reminding of that, whether it's the ongoing pandemic, ongoing challenges with democracy, thankfully recently avoided in the US, but we'll have to see about the inauguration, this ongoing fight for racial justice, the mental health crisis sitting behind it. I don't mean to depress us, but more to remind us of the importance of this work and the importance of technology and the new to kind of help us be thinking about these problems in a way that benefits all of us, not just a few. So I'd love to start by talking about language, just because for me, in my kind of part of the world, it feels kind of important. You know, we often talk about data as oil, as glitter, as gold, all of these kind of funny phrases that try and denote its importance to us and the qualities it has that are not shared with other resources. Do any of those phrases resonate with you? Stephen, I'd love to start with you, given how much of your work is kind of focused around AI, particularly. Another phrase that many of my friends who work in that field tell me is misunderstood.
Sure. So actually, I'm probably going to add another term for what
Please.
data might be. I like to think of it more like sand. It's everywhere, unevenly distributed, as you said. Often pretty useless on its own, but if it's processed in the right way, it can be extremely useful. So without sand, you can't build lots of buildings. If you process it right, you get lovely objects made of glass, that sort of thing. And frankly, if it gets in the wrong places, it can be quite inconvenient or uncomfortable, let's say. So I think it's moved, in my view, from being that sort of, oh, it's going to drive everything to it's there, but it needs handling in the right way. So that's sort of why I start thinking of it more like sands than other things. It doesn't have value necessarily on its own, but once you do something with it, the insights that it can give you have value.
I love that. That's so nice. I might borrow that if that's okay.
It's fine.
Amit or Zoe, anything strike you as particularly resonating for how we should think about data in this year particularly?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind going first. That's okay, Zoe. I think I just want to follow on from what Stephen has mentioned. I'm gonna use another G, but kind of looking into the future. And I think data is glue. And I think it's a way of bringing people together. And I think both you and Stephen mentioned that some people have it, some people have lots of it, some people have nothing. And I think we need to, especially for this year, bring more people together and trying to work together to solve some of the issues that we're kind of facing, particularly this year. And so obviously that's a big challenge in doing that. But of course, if we don't um, uh, pull that all together, then we'll face something like what Stephen has mentioned, where it is sand and it's very tricky to mold it into something that's kind of all over the place. So yeah, I kind of think that it's a very powerful thing. It's something that can bring a lot of people together. So I know it's a bit kind of forward, future thinking, but I think of it as a bit of a glue.
I love that.
Well, I've got one. It's pretty much like the sand, but it's not as eloquent as your explanation, Stephen. I was thinking it was like manure, but for very much the same reasons that you were saying. Having a big pile of it, there's nothing. You need to know how to spread it around to help your business grow, and more data doesn't always mean better. So too much manure, too hard to manage. And then sometimes it even causes damage like runoff. So very, very similar to your sound. But yeah, it's just definitely there's plenty of a lot of data around these days, but it's all about what you do with it and using the insights that you get from it. For me, where I look at it to promote positive change.
I love the malleability of these examples, like manure, sand, glue. These are all things that
I
are
think
something and
sand
nothing
is
at the same
nicer.
time. Yeah, well, but so on that note, given so many of these conversations around the future and data, um, can be a little bit hard to grasp sometimes. I'd love to ground us in some kind of practical examples, particularly this year. I know that all of you look for different kinds of things. Obviously, Zoe, you invest. Obviously, Stephen, you have your challenges. Amit, you're kind of working with all kinds of talent. I'd love to hear about data-fueled companies or approaches you've seen this year that have really inspired you. And it can be anything. It can be any particular area. I mean, obviously, we're in this conversation boundary by social challenges, but God knows we have an awful lot of them. And perhaps Zoe, if you'd love to kick us off as our investor.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, the amount that all my knowledge. I mean, I work as a VC. Everything's my whole brain is filled with what entrepreneurs teach me. Just like a sponge. So there's so many. So I'll just mention a few. I've been looking really into safety tech, which is one area of cybersecurity. Particularly, I've been focused on digital forensics. So identifying using large databases and being able to filter that to find child sexual abuse material and to be able to block that quickly and to be able to get it moderated better before it comes onto the human moderators. So all this is fascinating for me. And there's a company called Cyan Forensics that are doing this particularly well, almost like a breathalyzer. They've got you can insert their tech and within seconds it starts to detect. So what it is it acts as a barrier between different databases around the world. The first one it's doing is CADE, which is the child abuse image database in the UK, which is actually apparently the best one in the world. And that data in that database is so sensitive that you don't want anybody to be able to have access to it, but it acts as a filter mechanism, this piece of technology, so that you're still getting the matches on there from that hash database without anybody getting access to it. So things like that are just absolutely fascinating. And I think more investment needs to go into that area. And then another one, so I could go on forever, is biodiversity. So, I mean, I wouldn't call myself an expert. Again, there's a lady called Kat, who's CEO of a company called Nature Metrics. She's the founder there, and she was educating me the other day, just before we got locked down. Managed to get to Cambridge to see her, and she has this amazing company that's bringing the power of genetics to frontline ecology. So it's becoming more of a data play. So what she's got are these lab tests where anybody, so frontline staff, can be able to do the lab tests rather than it being the scientists. And because she can get these out and they're cheaper and it's quicker, she's amassing this amount of data that can be used to really improve our knowledge of biodiversity. This is an area that's pretty much untapped at the moment. And what's particularly interesting is it's not personal data. So it's not anyone's health, it's education. There's nothing in there. This is something that is primed for open data use. So for me, that's a really exciting area. And I'm not going to say any more. I'll let everyone else say.
Yeah, non-personal data is a bit of a trend this year, isn't it? Things that are entirely distinct from how we've conceived data in the past, perhaps of like our address information. Amit and Stephen, whoever would like to go first.
Yeah, sure. So we're quite fortunate through Experience House to get to work with some great organizations in various capacities and trend through education. And I think personally, I think some of the greatest work that we've been able to do in the last couple of years is working with the World Food Program Innovation Accelerator, and they're based in Munich, and I think Zoe, you're based in Munich, I believe that's correct, as well. And so they will often partner with various organizations from around the world. So it could be the Gates Foundation, it could be UNICEF or UNFPA. And we've been very fortunate to be able to travel out there and help various teams. It could be a design team, it could be academic led, which maybe we'll talk about a bit later on. But some of these teams have been doing some incredible work in using data to tackle some major challenges faced with regions that we don't often get to see and hear much about. And one of the teams that I enjoyed working the most with was using data to track vaccination delivery in rural areas of Pakistan. And so a lot of these teams are working on maternal health challenges. So to me, I've been very inspired by how data can help with such a challenge around maternal health. And of course, the World Food Program just won Nobel Prize for a lot of the work that they've been doing, especially around I think around COVID this year. So to me, the more kind of work that we get to work with them on these teams that are going through this accelerator program, the more I get to see how powerful the correct use of data can help in really fixing a lot of these major challenges that people in many deprived areas around the world are facing.
It's amazing.
So I think my examples are probably less high tech than those ones, but I think equally important. So one that sort of sticks in my mind right at the moment is here in the UK, as I'm sure has happened around the rest of the world, there's been regular updates from government around what's happening with coronavirus, COVID-19, what the plans need to be. And we've had the government chief scientist and the chief medical officer for England, at least in England, regularly coming on TV and showing graphs of how things are developing, showing graphics of hotspots of infection around the country. And for me, that's a change in how government is interacting with the population, in that it's more explaining the rationale, explaining the data behind the decisions that are being taken. So while it's not on the face of it particularly high tech, I think it's quite impactful for the general population. So that's one. The other is again in the sort of government or public service area, which is a sort of a silver lining to an effect of having the lockdowns, in that we've seen the legal sector in the UK for years and years resist digitizing, resist online activities as being simply not something that they can deal with, because they need to deal face to face, professional. They have to have everything in their office. And within 2 weeks of the first lockdown here in the UK, things changed. Pretty much every law firm was working remotely. You hear anecdotes of people previously saying, can't possibly have our office staff working from home because they have to be in the office for this particular piece of equipment that allows them to do note taking, etc. Immediately lockdown happens, they have to find a way. So suddenly they're all working from home, and court cases taking place online we've had over the last few months. So it's that sort of move and recognition that actually what is a very old industry and a very old-fashioned industry in many respects can also move into a more modern world. And I think that's a step that we can then build on for future activities.
I like that. I want to pick up on the first example you gave, Stephen, because it ties a little bit to Amit's. I'm lucky enough to chair the board of an amazing organization called Data for Change. And part of what they do is they help human rights organizations tell better stories. And, looking at the thread, how we talk to the populations we serve, citizens, consumers, whatever phrase you want to use, there's something really interesting about data and how it's perceived by the average member of the public. And I was thinking particularly about track and trace and all the COVID apps, and how successful they've been, how unsuccessful they've been, depending on where you are in the world. And I'm curious about, there's often this sense that heavy data use and responsibility stand in opposition. The innovation and responsibility don't go together, which I don't personally believe. But I'm curious, in this era where there is more public sensitivity perhaps to use of data because health data is all data now, how do you think companies leveraging data can do their best to kind of build trust with the audience base they're serving? Whether these are, Zoe, to your lovely example, kind of biotech enthusiasts, whether these are students, thinking of the audiences that all of you work with, how should founders, governments, teams think about this? How should they think about communicating what they're doing and why?
So maybe I'll jump in. First of all, I think it's probably a familiar thought these days, but an important one to keep coming back to, which is having the diversity of people within the team to actually recognize when you're not going in the right direction or having different viewpoints, etc. Because frankly, we as humans have evolved only to really interact with a limited number of people, right? So trust has built up on that. You know a few people and you can understand what's going on. But when you've got systems that are reaching millions, if not billions, of people around the world, then the differences in viewpoints, in approaches, are going to mean that some people think something's okay to do and others don't. So you need to try and get as broad a perspective as you can on what you're actually doing. That would be my first point. I don't know if one of the others would like to jump in.
Yeah, I think I probably follow on from that, especially from the education perspective and thinking about the students that come to do our courses. One of the first things we try and embed in their mindset, especially around experience design, is empathy. And I think that has to be, it kind of comes with that perspective and having that diverse way of thinking as well. And I think it also ties into, Stephen, what you were saying around the showcasing of the data down to the people that are going to be consuming it, and how you want to explain things, and understanding what some of their current frustrations are, or past frustrations are, when data has been used either misappropriately, or there's probably something, a documentary on Netflix that they watched, and all of a sudden it's changed their views on certain things. So I think that perspective is absolutely crucial. It's absolutely crucial in anything that we're teaching, especially around design and maybe using innovation and data there. And I think that it's that empathy and taking the time to really understand people's pain points, those frustrations, and then leveraging the data to say, right, we're going to use this responsibly and help you overcome some of those frustrations that you might currently have.
And Zoe, what do you see in your portfolio companies? How do they think about this issue and approaching it?
I think, well, from a governance perspective, we always we want them to be able to communicate what they have, how they secure it, and how they can report on it without some massive big audit. And it really depends whether we've got one company called Raremark, which works with patients with rare diseases to help get information that can contribute towards new drug discovery, where, in areas where people aren't funding it at the moment, and the people are scattered out around the world. And Raremark are very upfront with what data they collect and provide an open community to be able to, so the patients can feed back on what they think needs to be collected, what they want collected, and it's the transparency is really key on that, and everybody's all focused on the same thing, finding solutions to some of these diseases that they have that no one so far has found any cure for. So everyone's really driving for the same goal. But yeah, there's a lot of transparency, a lot of communication going on all the time. So if anything goes wrong, it'll spread like wildfire amongst those communities. And so it's not
Also
in
very
the business of the interest. Yeah, it's delicate information, very personal.
And I'm guessing that's why you're the right partner for that, because if there's something, oh, I should note, unbelievably, we only have 17 minutes left. So this is a public shout out for questions of our panel. Yeah, I think there's something about those kind of companies where they're set up from the very start. Their core mission is deeply tied into the values they have to serve that I particularly always like. I'd love to shift gears a bit and talk about the future, given that's the sort of theme of today's data futures. Noting the many crises that I emphasized at the beginning of the call, and having moved back recently from Silicon Valley, where I kept observing the election last week as one example of an area that seems to me ripe for great innovation, and yet I can't imagine Silicon Valley throwing billions at this particular problem because it's not particularly revenue generating. Obviously Europe is a very different place to the US, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts around opportunities you see, both for government and for private enterprise, for startups. Looking at problems or thematic areas that you feel have an awful lot of energy and opportunity right now. I'd love to future gaze a little bit, and particularly for those tuning in who might be looking for funding or funders. It'd be great to get a shout out on what you're looking for.
Okay, well, I think I've already mentioned biodiversity. That's just like one massive data flow waiting to be exploited there, and incredibly underfunded if you look at environment sustainability and the planetary boundaries as themes. It's right up there with climate change, and it's totally underutilized in impact investment, particularly. Not much is going in there, and that's because it struggled to find ways to monetize and to have a sustainable business model. But I think, things like nature metrics, reducing the cost and the ease of access to be able to collect this information just starts to change everything. You start to then get the right and accurate data in a good, decent enough size. So yeah, I'm excited about that. Other areas that I think government needs to contribute to, as well as impact investment, is public transport and mapping more efficient routes, getting more people to work. That's an area, there's about 3 or 4 seed companies at the moment that I'm tracking to see how they do that and how they monetize and who's paying. There's a lot for me coming in at a bit of a later stage. I'm fascinated by many of these areas, just like femtech and female health, and how different the female body responds to exercise, to diet, to stress. People are building things. They're not even building this in. All the data is just one-sided. I think there's lots of opportunities, and over the next 12 months, we'll start to see some of these come up to where we are at late seed, and we'll know where some of the business models are going because it'll have started to monetize. And there's lots of exciting areas that could go on forever.
Oh, I love it. Stephen, what are you excited by right now? Or what do you see as either what are you excited by, or what do you think somebody should hurry up and work on? I won't say solve because that
Well,
implies things that people have to solve, and that sounds silly.
sure. Zoe mentioned transport there and getting people to work. I think there is an interesting thing to develop society-wise as to whether we will be going to work as much as we have been, or whether it's more remote working. And then I think that leads to an interesting point around the use of office space or other commercial buildings. Can we utilize them more effectively in a shared way, and can use data around that on how that gets used? So that whole sort of real estate aspect, I think, could be quite interesting. I also think there's opportunities to use data and AI more effectively to increase access to justice, access to advisory services for people who maybe don't have access to them so well at the moment, or don't access them for whatever reason. So there's those sorts of areas. Maybe those aren't the big headline grabbing areas, but there's an untapped opportunity there. And then the big headline ones, well, net zero type things is obviously one that's at the forefront of many governments' minds right now. Climate change, etc. So working on that whole area, which impacts some industries that maybe aren't immediately at the forefront of thinking. So with the potential for increased flooding, the insurance industry, maybe that's more exposed than it ought to be. So working on data solutions around how that might need to change, etc., and helping that industry to get to a point where it's better capitalized against the risk that they have.
Very cool. It's quite hard talking about data and innovation without talking about uneven access to data, and of course the bias in much data. But Sophia Noble is a far better thinker than me on that, and she's on in about 15 minutes, so I would recommend tuning into her. But going back to uneven data access, I'm thinking particularly of the walled gardens of the largest American internet companies. Obviously, sort of fully open data or fully open data with certain constraints is very much in the ODI's wheelhouse. But how does this group think about how we persuade, how we nudge more data portability to keep smaller companies innovating, to share what's being given to the larger companies? How do we think about a more equal, level playing field in terms of data access?
I actually had a conversation with some academics yesterday, some professors that are working on some interesting work. They're American professors based out of American universities, but now I think a few of them are in Zimbabwe. So they're looking at using, getting access to data from various stakeholders and bringing them together through participatory workshops, et cetera, to then be able to use that data to help understand malnutrition in children in those regions. So again, a lot of the interest, not again to the previous question, they're not going to be probably the $1 billion generating ideas and things that we're going to be solving in Silicon Valley, but in massive impact. So I think and it kind of couples into the question before, where I think there's a great opportunity for academics and researchers to start to leverage using these workshops and getting the right stakeholders together because of the promise of a great solution in the end. But what they're sometimes struggling with is the tools. How do they capture this data? What do they do with the data afterwards? How do they model it? And I was stunned by kind of their plans and their ideas of who they were going to get in the room and some of the early prototypes, but they were very unaware of, once they've got the data, how do they manipulate it? What do they do with it to actually present it back to then inform actual positive change? So I think there's a great opportunity there. Maybe in some of the tools that could be used, maybe not so much in kind of the Western world, but some other areas of the world where some of that data access is definitely uneven, and then the right academics, the right researchers then pull it together to actually do something with it. So maybe there's some opportunities in the tool itself to make it.
I love that, like a trusted third party, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
I would love to
definitely
go to audience.
something. Oh, sorry, I was just going
No,
to
sorry.
support that. I mean, if you look at these walled gardens with, a few of the big players building up the amount of data that they've got, and not letting anyone else access, like your oil, basically, data as oil, feel the need for some kind of third party to intervene to stop there being monopoly of data and a stranglehold, to be for this, maybe for governments to step in, or a neutral third party to, like an Ofcom almost, to be able to stop them, having these walled gardens. Because if more money keeps being, used by the same big players, how much is left for everyone else? Yeah, it is a concern, and I think it's often in the press as well, the media. We keep up the pressure as the public. If the voice of Open Data Institute as well is there, people start to lobby to make sure these walled gardens come down. They need to.
I would love to go to audience questions. What misstep with data usage do you fear most when contemplating the future? And what action would you urge on the UK government and its data strategy consultation to avoid developing data in the wrong direction today? And that's sort of one question, 2 sentences. Shall I repeat it? What misstep
Please.
with data usage do
Yeah,
you
please.
fear most when contemplating the future? What action would you urge on the UK government to avoid developing data in the wrong direction today?
Yeah, that's a tricky one.
Yeah.
I guess the misstep is having someone who does have that sort of monopoly that we just discussed on data, using it in some inappropriate or
Or just for
not
commercial
necessarily
gain
malicious.
rather than
Well,
social good. Yeah.
I'm not so sure I'm against commercial gain, because I think a lot of good is driven by commercial interests of businesses. It certainly
But at the expense of social good, though.
Not necessarily. Sometimes you might see it that way, but I wouldn't say necessarily it's at the expense of social good. But I would fear that would be a misstep if someone with that access then uses it in a particularly destructive manner, whether it's deliberate or accidental. I'm not sure how you necessarily manage to stop that, though. So I'm not sure I can really answer the second part of that question. I don't know what Zoe
Well,
or
in
Amit
that case,
think.
yes, I was good. Would either of you like to take that one? That does seem like a particularly... Well, in that case, what resources or frameworks would you like to see to encourage responsible data innovation? And I have to give a shout out to the Data Ethics Canvas by the ODI, which obviously is the OG in this space. But what other resources and frameworks would you like to see our panel be available for founders, policymakers, tech people, the broader community? What else are we missing? What do we need? I was curious
What you're
about
talking
your
about is like, responsible use of data. So maybe there's a representative in each company or something like that, that has this responsibility to make sure that the data in that company is used ethically. So maybe to a governance level as well. So Sarah,
I
you
was
were
curious about
saying.
your comments. Well, I was curious about your comment earlier about boards and how boards can be useful, perhaps, in this conversation. I mean, you said yourself
Yeah,
earlier that if the founder is value aligned, it tends to follow through that the company itself will stick to its mission, be driven by the mission, therefore make you have more social good, etc. Is there anything there with
yeah,
the
the
board
way,
that would help at all?
yeah, I guess that's what I was just saying, that if there can be someone that's responsible for ethical data, whether it's part of one data processing officer kind of role, or whether it's on its own. I think something there could be quite powerful within companies. Whether it's actually treated seriously is another thing. I think there might have to be some intervention as to make sure that every board has this on by government or some kind of regulation around it, or quotas. I don't know, but yeah, the way that I would approach it, the way that I approach diversity and inclusion, the way that I support, ESG goals as well, is to start with the governance. That's the bit that I can have an influence on as an investor. So that's where I go.
And
Yeah,
Amit, what
just to
about with
follow.
your
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly follow on to that. I think if I remember correctly, I think we all have to register with the ICO, and we pay a fee for something around data. We have to nominate a data, somebody who's responsible for the data as it is. But I think to exactly what Zoe mentioned, what does that actually mean, and what does that role entail, and who's actually going to chase us up on what we're actually doing with that? I've not seen to date, and maybe we're obviously a small business, but I haven't seen to date anyone kind of taking us up on that. I think I would definitely start there, because as a small business that's starting to grow, we're starting to get more and more students, for example, coming in through the door, and we're starting to collect lots of great data, but we also have to make sure that we're using it ethically moving forward.
thank you. Stephen, what would you add? What would be on your wish list?
So I think there's quite a lot in place already. Frankly, it depends on the industry and the sort of potential harm that the data might cause, right? So you look at health, and that's highly regulated, right? You look at things like legal services; they're highly regulated. Entertainment, much less so. Right? So there is a lot in place already that can manage things. I think maybe there's a study necessary around where I was going to say where the unexpected harms might come from, but if they're unexpected, then how do you study it? But it's that sort of forward look and try and see um,
Around the
see
corner.
where
But perhaps you
things
could look
happen.
at negative externalities and impact. You could look at, you could map the possible negative externalities of the data that's collected and use it that way.
Yeah, you could do that.
Okay, so I'm afraid we are almost out of time. I'm so sorry to the many questions that we got that we're not able to get to. I would love to thank my wonderful panelists, Amit, Stephen, and Zoe, for their wonderful insight, and handing back over to the main room. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. It was a really interesting.